Welcome everyone. We're just going to wait a minute or two whilst everyone joins us. I think some people might still be joining us, but I'm just going to make a start at the moment. So, hi, my name's Laura Robertson, and I'm a researcher at the Poverty Alliance. Thank you for coming along to our Challenge Poverty Week webinar on the Serving the Future project. So as a bit of an introduction, the Serving the Future project is a collaborative project between Poverty Alliance, the Fraser of Allender Institute and the Institute for Inspiring Children's Futures at Strathclyde University, and is being funded through the Robertson Trust's Partners in Change programme. So in today's webinar, we're going to be sharing findings from the Serving the Future project that we've been conducting for the last 18 months. We've been working with workers and employers from the hospitality sector in Scotland to understand what are some of the demands and challenges from both sides around addressing issues around in-work poverty in Scotland. So the focus of today's webinar is very much about policy insights, so learning for national and local governments from our research so far. And we'll be sharing critical insights from both the workers and employers who've been participating in the research and highlighting what some of the key policy implications are from the research. You can also find more about our project, including key outputs on the Serving the Future website and via the Serving Future Twitter account as well. So a bit of introductions before I move on. So I'm joined today by Callum Fox, who is an associate economist at the Fraser of Allender Institute, Helen Timbrell, who is an independent consultant who is working with us on the project specifically with employers, Fiona McCarty, who is the Research and Information Manager at Poverty Alliance, and Emma Congreve from Fraser of Allender Institute was going to be joining us today, but unfortunately she is not well and not able to join. So what is Serving the Future about, and why have we specifically focused on the hospitality sector? So we're looking at the hospitality sector because it is a very distinct sector. It has one of the highest rates of low pay in Scotland. It also has high rates of insecure hours and underemployment. And there have been very specific challenges facing businesses in recent years. Our project is seeking to understand what some of those challenges are, and also to share learning about how in-work poverty could be tackled and prevented in the hospitality sector, but also more widely in other low-paid sectors in the UK. And by working with both employers and workers, we've been able to take a really innovative approach to understand what the demands are and the challenges from both perspectives. And we've taken a variety of approaches to identify kind of changes that could be made at an organisational employer level, but also the policy and systems-wide changes that need to happen to address in-work poverty in Scotland. And that's what we're mainly going to be focusing on today. So to give you a little bit of context and overview about our project. So longitudinal research is a really key part of Serving the Future. So we've been speaking to 27 hospitality workers. We've done the first set of interviews with a range of workers who are working in urban and rural areas and for different hospitality businesses across Scotland. And we've been specifically looking to understand changes over time in relation to financial insecurity and also in relation to their work circumstances. So we just completed the Wave 1 interviews this summer and are currently in the phase of speaking to workers again. And the focus is very much on adults whose main job is in the sector. So we've not been recruiting or speaking to students who are working part-time in the sector. And alongside this, we've been using a methodology called action learning sets, which has been used in a range of sectors, and it involves working with a small group of employers and sharing learning and using it as a tool to support sustainable change within the sector. And this has provided some really important examples about what employers can do, but also the support that they need to be able to support workers. And I'd really encourage you all to have a look at the report that we published a couple of weeks ago on the Serving the Future website that shares more in depth the findings from the action learning sets with employers. We've also used another approach which is quite widely used in other private sector businesses, and it's called strategic foresight, and it's a method that is used to look at potential scenarios in the future. What could the hospitality sector look like in 10 years' time, and then identifying solutions to tackle low pay and other issues that are present in the sector. I am now going to pass on to Callum, who is going to talk a little bit about pay and poverty within the hospitality workforce.
Thank you, Lauren. So firstly, I'm going to provide you with a bit of an overview on the hospitality sector in Scotland. So undoubtedly, the hospitality sector is a really important and integral part of the Scottish economy. In 2021, the Scottish hospitality industry contributed 3.9 billion in gross value added to the Scottish economy. Gross value added can be thought of very similar to GDP in that it measures the level of economic activity in a particular sector of the Scottish economy. In 2021, the Scottish hospitality industry also provides employment for 196,000 workers across Scotland. This is a really large number, and it accounts for about 7% of total employment throughout all of Scotland in 2021. However, although the Scottish hospitality sector is a really important source of employment across all Scotland, in some parts of the country, the level of employment provided by the Scottish hospitality sector is particularly important. For example, in remote rural parts of Scotland, so that's those areas of the country that have a population that is less than 3,000 people and is more than a 30-minute drive to larger settlements of 10,000 people or more. In those parts of the country, the hospitality sector was found to support 15% of all employment, which is a far higher rate than the level of employment supported by the hospitality in areas of Scotland we class as accessible rural. So that's areas that are still got a population below 3,000, but are far closer to these larger settlements, whereby they can be reached in a 30-minute drive. There's also a greater level of employment compared to more urban parts of the countries, like the towns and cities distributed across the country. If we look at the chart on the right-hand side of your screens right now, that chart shows the hospitality sector share of total employment across each local authority in Scotland. So it's colour coded, whereby the lighter areas, those kind of white areas that you might see on your screen, they're the areas of Scotland, the local authorities, whereby the hospitality sector provides quite a low share of the total employment in these local authorities. And then conversely, in kind of the darker shaded blue areas, they're the parts of Scotland whereby the hospitality sector provides a really high proportion of the total employment in the local authority, and is therefore really important to local employment in these local communities. So if we look at this chart, in the Central Belt area, what you'll observe is that there's quite a lot of these lighter colours, so these like these light blues, and this indicates that there's about in local authorities, like for example like Edinburgh or Glasgow, for example, there's quite a low share of the total employment provided by the hospitality sector. And this is for a variety of reasons. So for example, say in Edinburgh, you've got quite a large financial services sector. So you might assume that that might make up a greater share of the total employment compared to the hospitality sector. Whereas if you go, for example, a bit further north, so for example, Perth and Kinross or Argyll and Bute or Highland, in those parts of Scotland or in those parts of the map, you'll see quite dark shades of blue. And that really indicates that the hospitality sector is really important to these local authorities, particularly in these more rural parts of the country, whereby the hospitality sector might, for example, employ around 10 or 12% of the workforce, and is therefore a really important source not only of employment, but of income for these local communities throughout these parts of Scotland. Thank you. Can we move to the next slide, please? So moving on to pay and contracts in the Scottish hospitality sector. So median pay in the Scottish hospitality sector was £10 per hour in 2022. This is a value that is significantly lower than median pay across the entire Scottish economy, which stood at £15 and 3 pence in 2022. Because median pay in the Scottish hospitality sector was less than 2/3 of median hourly pay, this means that through the OECD classification, the Scottish hospitality sector can be classified as one of those industries in Scotland which is characterised by low pay. If we look in the annual survey of hours and earnings, what we observe in that data set is that even the highest 10% of workers within the Scottish hospitality sector were paid a wage that fell below the Scottish average of £15 and 3 pence in 2022. Finally, if you're looking at the Joseph Rowntree Fund publications this week, you would have saw that yesterday, Joseph Rowntree published their report of poverty in Scotland, which indicated that 62% of workers in the Scottish hospitality sector were paid a wage that fell below the real living wage in 2022. This is a really high percentage of the workforce, and really importantly, it's one of the sectors that they identified as having the highest likelihood of workers earning a wage below the real living wage in 2022 across all the different sectors in Scotland. Highlighting that the Scottish hospitality sector is one of those sectors of the Scottish economy which really suffers from issues of low pay. In addition, in the Joseph Rowntree Foundation report, they also identified that about 17% of the Scottish hospitality workforce were underemployed in 2022. By underemployed, this means that if these workers were given the opportunity, they'd be willing to work more hours. So that could be, for example, picking up more shifts. In addition, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation also highlighted that 21% of the Scottish hospitality workforce were on insecure contracts in 2022. By these insecure contracts, the ones that we usually hear about, most of these 0 hours contracts, which you might hear about in the news. These often refer to unpredictable or unguaranteed forms of work, and these can have lots of implications for individuals working in the hospitality sector. For example, if an individual doesn't know how many hours they're going to work next week, then they don't know what their income is going to be next week. And this can create significant challenges related to financial stability, particularly when they've got these fixed costs like their rent or their food shops that they need a certain level of income to pay for. Can you move to the next slide, please, Laura? So looking at rates of poverty that apply to the Scottish hospitality sector. So in Scotland, rates of poverty tend to be higher for households with a hospitality worker within the household relative to households which do not. So between 2019 and 2020 and 2021 and 2022, on average, about 25% of households with a hospitality worker within the household were in poverty. This is a rate which exceeds the average for households which did not have a hospitality worker within their household, where the value for those households that were in poverty was about 21%. If you look at the chart on the screen now, you'll see the number of households that were in poverty in Scotland over the time period I specified that had a hospitality worker as part of the households. So what we can see from this data set is that there was about 140,000 households within Scotland over the time period I specified that were earning an income that put them below the poverty line. Really important to note here is that those first 2 bars on the chart, they refer to households that have children. And this highlights that of that 140,000 households which were in poverty, and we had a hospitality worker, about 40,000 of which also had children as part of the households, showing that these issues of low pay in industry can have these wide-ranging repercussions, not just for individuals working within the hospitality industry, but their families as well and the households that they currently live in. Thank you, Laura. I'll now pass you on for the next section of the presentation.
So I'm now going to move on to sharing findings from the longitudinal research we've been doing with workers. Before I do, I should have said at the beginning, please do add any questions that you have for us in the Q&A, and we'll have time at the end to answer some of those. So in relation to workers' experiences, the policy briefing that we've published today has highlighted that the workers are experiencing financial insecurity and instability working in this sector. But it is not the role of just employers to address issues around in-work poverty. There are gaps in policy and support and services for people in low-paid work in Scotland. So in our briefing that we published today, we've highlighted practices that could be addressed by employers. We've also shared critical issues in relation to improvements that need to be made by public services, which are the responsibility of government and of local authorities. And we've also raised issues within the briefing where businesses require more support from government, and that government, businesses and sector bodies need to work together to tackle some of these challenges. So in terms of the critical issues shared by workers, so I'm just going to touch on some of the key themes that have come out of the research in my presentation today. There's a lot more in the report from the interviews with workers, particularly around experiences of job quality. So we've looked at things like Callum was talking about, insecure work, and the prevalence of zero-hour contracts and the impacts of zero-hour contracts, for example. We've also looked at indicators of job quality around experiences of management and progression and training, and highlighted some of the gaps there that workers have shared with us. Another key another key job quality criteria is around health, and we've heard a lot from workers around experiences of mental health problems for workers in the sector, particularly as a result of late night working, for example, and we believe that that's a really critical issue that needs to be looked at. So hospitality workers in the research have reported struggling with instability of their incomes. This was the case across all of the interviews that we have conducted as part of Serving the Future. And unstable incomes are the result of several factors. So the key thing is low pay and insecure hours. So zero-hour contracts and casual working conditions in particular were common for our participants. And that creates insecurity because they do not know how many hours that they are going to get. Another key issue that has been raised is housing and the costs of housing, particularly in the private rented sector, and rising costs over the last couple of years. Several of our participants were also homeowners and were very worried about increases with their mortgage due to higher interest rates. And for some of our participants who were receiving universal credit alongside working, there was confusion around universal credit entitlement. So the way universal credit works is that it's based on an assessment period for the previous month. And that means in some months, a universal credit claimant may not be entitled to any universal credit, whilst in other months they will be, depending on how their wage from the month before. Many of the workers said that they found this really difficult because variations in payments made it difficult for them to plan. And it's also another issue around implications for other income sources through other benefits, because universal credit is a passported benefit, basically meaning that you will only be able to access other benefits such as the Scottish Child Payment if you're in receipt of universal credit in that month. And there's a quote from one of the workers that had taken part in the research here at ANA, basically highlighting that her universal credit varies so much. So she doesn't feel like it's something that she can consistently rely on. A second issue that I'm going to touch on is issues with childcare. So whilst there's been an extension in free childcare in Scotland in recent years, childcare is a really significant issue for hospitality workers because they don't work traditional working hours, and there's a lack of availability of childcare outside of traditional working hours. It's particularly an issue for people that we spoke to in rural areas, where there was a lack of early years childcare, but also after school childcare and childcare during holidays as well. So we heard from one parent who lived in a rural area who was not able to access any childcare within her local area, and her employer had provided support for parents by letting them bring in a child whilst they were working, but they were only allowed to bring one child in, so she had to leave her two older children at home while she was working during the summer. So there were a few examples like that of some parents being able to work around with a bit of support from employers. It was difficult for both couples and single parents. So couples had to juggle care between one of them working a day shift, one working a night shift. But for single parents, it was particularly challenging if they had no other family to provide support. And the quote from Elena below basically shows how much money that the nursery was going to cost, and how much planning and thinking that her and her partner had to do around that. And Corinne touches on the fact that if she did not have family around about her to provide support with childcare, she probably wouldn't have had the option to return to work. So another issue raised by hospitality workers in Serving the Future is challenges with the cost and availability of late night transport. So the sector differs from other low-paid industries in terms of the high level of late night working. For those working in the sector, they face additional costs because of this, with a lack of public transport late at night, meaning they often have to resort to paying for a taxi. But we also heard several examples of workers walking home from work at distances of ranging between like half an hour or an hour to get back to their home. And that obviously is very concerning in relation to their safety. One thing that we have spoken to workers about is Unite's campaign called Get Me Home Safely, where they have been campaigning for employers to provide support with taxis or transport costs home. And during the research, Glasgow City Council has embedded that approach, but at this point, only for new businesses. So we're looking to speak to workers about whether they have been impacted by that and what the impacts have been for them. There's another quote here from a participant who lived in a rural area. So the lack of transport infrastructure in rural areas was a barrier in particular. So Jamie, who we spoke to, had to buy a car purely for the purposes of work. because there was no other options for him to get to and from his workplace. And whilst we did hear examples of employers working around shifts and the availability of public transport for individual workers, we feel that this is something that needs to be addressed more widely, and that local governments need to ensure that there's sufficient public transport services available to make sure workers can get home. So another critical issue is around progression in the sector. So Callum mentioned that the sector has high levels of underemployment. So part of the issue here is, and this is also raised by employers that we've been speaking to, is that for small businesses, there are fewer opportunities available to provide progression. For workers, the key barriers around little extra pay when there are progression opportunities. So many of them said that they didn't want to take on the extra responsibilities required of a higher level role for very minimum extra pay. Another critical issue is around the training and education sector for the hospitality sector, which has been raised again by both workers and employers, who feel that there's a gap in provision of certification and qualification for workers in this sector. And in our research, we've identified several criteria of what a good job would look like in the sector. And one of the really strong things that workers said was certification and qualification opportunities, and being able to then progress in the sector. So a small number of the workers that we've spoken to have been based in rural areas. So I've touched already on the transport issues around this. But one of the key issues is seasonal work in rural areas for the hospitality sector. And several of our workers work for hotels, which either close for several months during the winter periods or have reduced hours during the winter months, which has massive implications for the workers we're speaking to, who shared examples of struggling to pay bills and rent during the winter period. Another thing that we touched on in the report is higher cost of living, and particularly as a result of the cost of living crisis. So we've been able to, over time, track how participants are managing with higher cost of living and what some of the key costs are that they are struggling with. So rural areas in particular, higher fuel costs have been a key issue for participants in the research, and also lack of options around foods and the implications for having to spend more on food as well. So the quote here is from Suzanne, who is another worker in the research and lives in a remote rural area. So she shares that she eventually had to leave the hotel that she was working in because it left her 4 months trying to find work in a small village. So she couldn't find a job in winter, and she suggests there is more that the government could do. And she calls it here a retainer. Is there some way that staff could in the sector could be paid some sort of wage for the months in which hospitality businesses are closed during the winter period? Now we're going to be moving on to the employers' experiences from our research. The speaker, Helen, is due to join us at the moment. So I think what I'm going to do is just move on to the video that we have that we've made with employers who've been taking part in the research. So Emma Congreve recorded a conversation with 2 of the employers who have been participating in the action learning sets to understand what are some of the significant issues that employers are facing. The employers in the action learning sets all shared examples of wanting to be able to better support workers and to tackle in-work poverty. So we wanted to share their experiences of some of the challenges they've been faced with, and also what some of the learning has been from the action learning sets as well, that they would like to share with other employers.
So you've both been involved in our Serving the Future project, and you know, we've learned a lot from you. And the first question I've got is around what you feel the key issues are facing hospitality businesses across Scotland, and any particular kind of issues facing rural businesses in particular. So Sam, do you want to start?
Yeah, so we've nearly come to the end of this season for us. We do have 6 weeks or so left, but the big busy bit is done. And I think we spoke at the start what we thought the challenges would be, and they sort of, yes, all turned out to be true. Staffing, staff accommodation, and the cost of energy is just so our forecast this year has us looking at losing money, and you know, we're hitting our margins. The wage bill is the right percentage, but everything below the line is just, it's just too much, you know, and it keeps going up and up. And it's not just energy, it's the cost of supplies, cost of food, everything like that.
Cost of staff as well, Sam.
Cost of staff, yeah, cost of staff. I mean, we put our wage percentage up to 37% this year, which is really high for the industry. But it did mean that we were one of the few businesses around here to actually be open all the hours we committed to be open. Obviously it's hearsay, but there's so many places around about that end up just opening like 5 nights a week, or, you know, no lunches, because they literally don't have the staff to run. So a random really busy Monday or Tuesday night, and then we'll find out, oh, it's because the yacht haven 5 miles away just closed that day, so everybody that stays there, you know, had to go somewhere to eat. So yeah, so it's just really sad. And obviously the main difference I would say with a rural property would be the fact that there aren't enough locals to work here, so we do have to have people that come and live in staff accommodation. So obviously that's quite tricky as well, being able to have enough of it, and sometimes having to sacrifice a bedroom for a month that you could sell for £200 a night to put a waitress in. Just to keep the business going. We rent private properties, and the staff don't pay a penny to stay there. So that's quite difficult too. But if you want staff, you have to give them somewhere to live. So
yeah, I mean, that's a message we've heard quite a lot, that businesses are having to kind of provide things like housing, sometimes transport solutions, things that you would in other sectors of the economy, it isn't on the business to provide that. And I just feel like something that's quite different about hospitality.
And even if you do charge them, I think the maximum you can charge at the moment is £9 something a day, due to the government policy. So
50p an hour back in the day.
That doesn't come close to covering the cost of the mortgage or the rent or the bills or anything like that. So that's just an extra cost that we have to put.
And thinking about where there might be solutions, so a big part of why we've done this project is to really try and think about how changes can be made that sort of, you know, moves the industry on and makes life better for some of the workers in the industry as well. And so obviously there are some things that businesses can do, but where else are you looking for kind of support from, maybe from local, national governments, that type of thing?
Well, obviously the easiest one that comes to mind is subsidies for accommodation, but even just we built 5 pods this year to put people in. Even just a bit of a grant to help with that. That would be really, really useful. Especially when if we can show that we're actually creating more jobs, for people, we would hope that would help a little bit.
Can I say that if Sam manages to successfully staff her buildings and everyone up north successfully staffs their buildings, then down here, we're going to have no staff left. Because you've taken all of our European fodder.
Yeah.
Like, you've taken all of our young staff, you've taken all away, like, our student staff, you've taken away everyone that can potentially work for us that isn't local to our areas. Like, that's what recent policy has done. People can't move, people can leave their areas, people can't just, they physically prevented our workforce from coming to us this year. Because genuinely, if the north gets staffed, then the city of Glasgow is not being staffed. We don't have it.
Traditionally, our staff accommodation the seasonal staff that we need to take on would definitely have been not from the UK.
Get me on start about the price of rates as far as the hospitality industry is concerned. We pay astronomical rates for nothing. I am yet to be told what it is we get for that rates provision.
So that's one area where you could be looking for some kind of changes to be made.
So that's the sort of stuff they need to do. Start thinking about the businesses first. Put us first. Start wondering what it is we get for our money. If you're going to start sending out letters about the fact that we owe you rates, start putting in the letters what it is we get for our rates, and then maybe we can address the fact that it's not fair. We pay astronomically for our refuse collection because we have to pay a private company to do so. All sorts of different things that bring in the
So
I get very intense.
So one of the things that we've been really encouraged by is the engagement of you guys in the project, and how clearly you do understand the pressures that your workforce is under, as well as trying to deal with running a business yourself. And I'd just be interested in, are there things from this process that you've taken away and thought about, things you can do in your own business, either now or in the future, that this kind of chance to step back and have a think and sort of talk to your peers in the industry has helped with?
Sorry, Sam.
Okay, I learned so much from everybody else that was in the program, and I'll always be really, really grateful that I did it. For me, 2 specifics would be that we got wage stream in our business, which we pay our wages monthly. This allows the staff to collect 50% of everything they've earned at any point, as soon as they've earned it, so they can't go into debt if they have any unexpected bills to pay. And then just from my own action learning set, I talked about communicating more with the team, and we have started. I'm not doing it as intricately as I would like to, but I do every month give them the forecast for the rest of the year and the sales for the month before as the info comes out. So I feel like that's been really good, and I do feel it's the main goal I wanted with that was to actually take away some of their fear, because I think our staff very much look at what's happening in the world and do really worry for their jobs. So that's helped.
I personally also got some great ideas from the team and from the various folk in the hospitality sector that we were working with. One was the sort of trying to balance out the wages better on behalf of the staff, maybe taking some hours from them in the summer and redistributing it in the winter, but I haven't been able to do that within the business that I'm in because we've moved on, but it was certainly something that I have placed within that business for them to think about, and it's one that I would probably put into place in the future for sure, but I would put it into place right from the off, it would be my introduction thing, I would think. And then the other I guess there's a joy in other people's misery, like the fact that you're all in it together and we're all feeling the same thing. You feel like you're not actually sometimes I think when you're in amongst something and you've been doing it for some time, you can sometimes feel it's you, you know, like, and it's just me.
Yeah.
Is it hard? Like, why are we not hitting the targets? Why are we not bringing enough in? You know, it's not you, because I've been in the industry long enough to know if I'm busy or not, you know, like, so I know when we are busy and when we're not busy, and when we should be paying our bills and when we shouldn't be paying our bills. But it doesn't matter how busy we are, there's not enough money to come in to pay the bills at the moment. The cost of electricity, energy, and the cost of staff, and the cost of supplies because of the cost of energy is an issue. But certainly to know that it's a collective problem, and to know that you guys, you know, like Emma and your team, you know, like, are actually trying to form that together and make it a problem that is visible for other folk to realise, you know, like, so that for me has been a real positive from the programme. And it's always good to talk to peers about situations and things, you know, and it's been quite a pleasure to pass on some information too, and to share my knowledge, you know, to actually know that you've got something to share is quite pleasant too.
Okay, so we're really grateful for the employers who participated in the research, sharing some of their reflections there. So we've been joined by Helen, who's going to now speak about some of the findings from the action learning sets. I'm just going to move back a couple of slides. There we go, Helen.
Perfect. Thanks, Laura. Hello, folks. So I have been supporting the Action Learning Set as the facilitator. So have worked with them through each of the sessions from the very beginning when they were recruited right through to the end of the programme. And it's lovely actually to join and see Tony and Sam reflecting on their experience in that way. It was, even as the facilitator, it was a really rich experience to be part of. And I had a real sense of privilege of working alongside them as they worked through some of the challenges they were facing. And they were certainly facing challenges. So you can see here, they told us really clearly, and this was a consistent message in the months that we worked with them, that the cumulative effect of COVID, of Brexit, and of the cost of living crisis has created what they described as the most challenging operating context that they had seen. And that was the case for people like Tony that you've just met, who had been in the hospitality industry for decades. So consistent message that came over the period of time and didn't seem to let up in any of the period of time that we were working with them. And you can see that that's a finding that's supported by external data. So the Scottish Tourism Alliance data, where the finding is that more than half of tourism and hospitality businesses are still in that survival mode. So in May, June, still in survival mode, or at best in consolidation. So a really challenging external context in which they were trying to operate. But despite that, by working together in that action learning set, the participating employers were able to identify, and in some cases able to begin to action, several changes which were positively impacting their business, and in some cases improved the experience that their employees were having. So across the action learning sets, the months that we were working together, they covered a range of different topics and sought advice and guidance from each other on how to deal with them. So that included things around repeated sickness and other reasons for absence, in some cases linked to physical and mental well-being. They explored issues around staff engagement and motivation, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a sec. And they particularly focused on the challenges around recruitment, which felt like a consistent challenge in almost all of the businesses for some of the reasons that you've just heard Sam and Tony talk about. Some of their previous supply of staff for their businesses was no longer available to them. So if we dig into one of the experiences that we explored in a bit more detail in one of our action learning sets. So if you like, this is a case study for someone who was a participant in the group. So the issue that they brought to the group that they wanted to explore was that they were a largely rural employer, and they were struggling to maintain staff engagement and motivation in the period from January to March. So they talked about the kind of the cycle of activity that's in the hospitality business, the peak that comes over Christmas and New Year, and then this dip where trade is slower, there are fewer people coming into businesses, there are fewer customers, you need to retain staff, but it's hard to keep them engaged and motivated because there is less work, they have less hours, there are less tips. It's just a less buoyant and energizing experience. So working together, what the Action Learning Set participants explored was the potential for annualized hours. So this shift to moving to paying a regular amount through the year rather than the salary that people were receiving, reflecting the number of hours that they'd worked in that particular month. And for some members of our group, the very notion of annualized hours was brand new to them. So this was a good example of where you bring together participants who have experience in a particular thing and for whom it's normal and natural and they work in that way, working with people who'd never even conceived of annualized hours as something that could help with staff retention and staff motivation. They also talked about staff recognition schemes and they shared ideas for how to do staff recognition well. And it was interesting to see single site operating models comparing their recognition schemes with those who were working across multiple sites. They talked a lot about staff appraisals, with sort of varying degrees of formality around that, but creating opportunities to give staff feedback to support them with their training and development as a way of keeping them engaged and motivated. And they also talked about succession planning, using this quiet time to invest in conversations with staff that could help them think about planning a longer term career in hospitality, moving from an initial frontline role into a supervisor role and then into management, using that quiet time to invest in those conversations and support the career development and succession planning for the business. In terms of the short-term actions that the employer who brought this issue chose to take, they agreed to explore moving to annualized hours contracts and to consider how to increase feedback channels for staff. So that what became clear through the conversations with their peers was that there wasn't a clear route for staff to be generating ideas and contributing suggestions to how to improve the experience that they were having. They created an Employee of the Month scheme. And what was really interesting was that prior to the discussion, they'd had a manager scheme, they'd had a manager recognition scheme, but they'd had nothing for the more junior and frontline employees. And there was this lovely moment in the Action Learning Set of kind of recognition that was a really simple thing that they could do. They could model their Manager of the Month or manager recognition scheme and introduce something similar for their general employees. And they were going to consider whether there was a role for something around appraisals for all of their staff. In terms of the more longer term actions, actually what they realised through time and through exploration of annualised hours was that was not a quick fix, and that was going to take some time to put in place. And there was a real transition for them around literally having enough money in the bank to move to annualised hours, and that needed some working through. And to work in partnership with staff closer to the low season and discuss options with them, because of course by the time we were working together in the Action Learning Set, it wasn't January to March. So when we began this conversation, the employer was just moving out of that quiet period and was about to face into April and then spring and then the start of summer. So they made a call that actually to try and implement more change as they were going into the busy time would be unhelpful, but to work with staff to make the changes in advance of January and March for next year. So a good combination of short-term solutions, long-term solutions, and real space to explore what this issue meant for them. And you have heard from Sam and Tony already, I know, who reflected on both the content of what they covered and how the experience was for them.
Thank you, Helen. I'm just going to move on to the next slide, unless it makes try and play the video now.
Oh,
so I'm just going to finish off with the reflections from our presentation today. So you've heard from the angles of workers and also from employers what some of the challenges are that they're facing. And at this midpoint in the Serving the Future project, we've been thinking really hard about what are some of the implications here for the sector and also for local and national government. We have highlighted some of these here and go into more detail in the policy briefing that was published, as well as the an industry briefing that we created specifically for hospitality businesses and for sector bodies, which was published a few weeks ago. So it's a very, very complex area, and in addressing in work poverty, there's no simple single solution. What we wanted to highlight here is that there are limits on employers in terms of what they can do, and that there are gaps in support for employers and for workers, particularly around addressing in-work poverty. So we've identified some of the key drivers of in-work poverty for families in this presentation. So having to juggle work with childcare, the high cost of childcare, issues around universal credit and instability of receiving support through social security when you're in work, and also other costs around transport, which are very critical for people that work in the sector because of the nature of late night working. This is also a period with rising costs, and those households on the lowest paid work are struggling most with costs which have been rising, in particular such as food and energy bills. We've also highlighted some of the issues around sustainability of the hospitality sector through doing the action learning sets and through the work that we've done with employers. And I think there's some really useful learning, particularly just from that case study that Helen highlighted there, about ways that employers can address issues in the sector and support workers. But again, there's more support needed by the sector and more of a relationship that needs to be built between the government and the sector. So as we move on to the next stages of the Serving the Future project, we will be continuing to work with the sector, policy actors and workers to explore ongoing challenges, as well as routes forward. We very much want learning to take place at a wider level from this research, so across the sector and other low-paid sectors within Scotland, and want the recommendations that we make from this research to come from workers and employers themselves. So we've just got one last slide that has the link to the website and also to our Twitter. So please do have a look there. We have a newsletter that we've recently created that you can sign up to, and that will give you updates on what we're doing in the project. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen at the moment. So we've actually got quite a lot of time left for doing Q&A. So please do put any questions that you have in the Q&A. If you do want to get in touch with us, you can find the contact detail for the project on our website as well. So please do get in touch if you want to have a further conversation about the project. So I'm just having a look. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A at the moment. Sarah Jane has put a comment around worrying about median pay for professional cookery and the hospitality sector, and the expense of late nights or unavailable travel. So yeah, touching on the fact that a lot of workers are reliant on public transport, but they are not able to access it if they're in late night forms of employment, and the costs of taxis are so extortionate that some of the workers we spoke to are spending a large proportion of their income on getting taxis home. So from Kelly Johnston, from the 27 employers engaged, was there no examples of positive initiatives business have in place and particularly improved after the pandemic, like mental health support, pay increases and more flexible hours, employee assistance programs? So the 27 participants were employees rather than employers. I could touch on this from the workers angle, and then Helen, perhaps if there's anything you want to share from Action Learning Sets. So yeah, there was loads of examples of really good practice in the sector shared by workers, and we have highlighted some of those in the report, the longitudinal report with that we published with workers, and examples of good practice, in particular around progression and training, and certain employers really providing support at an individual level, and encouraging workers to develop new skills and take on other responsibilities in order to be able to progress within the sector. In terms of mental health support, we did have one or two examples from workers of employers who have been kind of gone the extra mile. And so one worker shared with us that her employer had paid to provide counselling for her after she went off sick due to struggling with her mental health. But overall, this was a recurrent theme within the research, with just a lack of knowledge about where to go to get support. I think this came up with the workers in relation to bodies that are already out there, that with employers in relation to sector bodies that are already out there that they could go to get support or share advice and information with their employees. Pay increases. There wasn't any examples of pay increases. Most of the employers, most of the employees rather, are on national minimum wage or the real living wage. We did speak to some people in more senior positions who did have a slightly higher wage, and a few who had salaries, and they really highlighted the benefits of that, having previously worked in the sector and had kind of variable hours and being paid hourly as well. So Helen, is there anything from the Action Learning Sets with employers around any of those issues?
Yeah, I guess the question has made me think of a couple of specific examples. And of course, this is employers sharing them with other employers. So how they've been received by employees, it's the employer telling me that rather than me having direct conversations with the employees. But a couple of examples that spring to mind. So there was a lovely example of one of the employers had chosen to allow employees to order food through their suppliers. So through their catering suppliers, they were allowing staff to order and purchase food as part of their kind of commercial order, because that was a way to support their employees with increased food costs. So it was cheaper for them to order their food and buy food as part of the employing organisation order. And that was a lovely example of people just responding in a really human way, I think, to a very practical solution to some of the cost of living, and something that was kind of felt to be just a nice thing to do. There was also examples of, in a almost completely different vein, choosing to invest time in communicating with their employees about the precarious state of the business. And employers talked about that as being a bit high risk. So while they wanted to be really open and honest with their employees about the situations that they were facing, so that employees understood why they couldn't actually increase wages or why they couldn't extend hours, they wanted to give the context for that with the intention that the employees would better understand and feel more included. They knew that it was not without risk, because it risked creating a sense of uncertainty and anxiety if the business was in quite a precarious position. But it was described as having had a positive benefit in terms of employees feeling valued, feeling part of the team, wanting to go that extra mile because they understood the degree of challenging context that business was in. In terms of pay increases for the participating employers in the Action Learning Set, that was really challenging. And actually, they talked about not being in a position to increase pay and really struggling with the real living wage. But on the flip side, they did talk about lots of examples of the way in which they were walking alongside their employees to help them when they were facing difficulties. So they would routinely, some of them, talk about needing to provide support to employees when there was a family breakdown, or there was a challenge with children, or a member of the family in a couple of cases had got into difficulty with the police, and the extent to which as employers they provided almost kind of pastoral support or care for their employee when they were facing those difficult situations. So that might turn up as flexing their hours and allowing them to start a shift late, or it might turn up as accompanying them to the police station, as was the case in some circumstances. So that sort of human, personal, pastoral support seemed to be increasing in line with the increasing challenging context that employees were in. So employers talked about a number of different kind of practical and emotional ways in which they were supporting employees, I think.
I just wanted to add on to Laura's point then. Even though a lot of the employees reported that, for example, their pay hadn't increased that much since COVID, something that we did find that employers had put in place was that often when it came to tipping, instead of it being like an optional charge, several employers reported that it was now they'd add like a 12.5% like mandatory tip on that you could ask to be taken off, but it was automatically applied to the bill, and that had quite a large impact on individuals working in the hospitality sector, because it was this additional part of their wage which they received post-COVID from an action taken by their employer.
Thanks, Callum. So there was a couple of other points in the Q&A about employers and yeah, the training. If an employer upskills employees, do they fear them moving on or losing them? That's a really interesting question. We are planning to do a second action learning set with an employer from January till April next year. So all of these kind of questions are really useful for us to be speaking to the sector about. That's a really, really good point.
Just on that, Laura, it might be helpful to share it so that it wasn't something that the action learning set employers talked about, if that's helpful, Drew, in response to the question. The fear wasn't my experience of working with them wasn't that they held off or didn't invest in training because they thought people would leave. Pay was why people were leaving, or finding the working environment stressful was why people were leaving, or it just being a kind of an employee market. There are so many vacancies, it is really easy to move around. And so perhaps, whereas in the past an employee might have put up with or kind of stayed with an employer for a longer period of time, there was no need to do that because there were so many opportunities for them, particularly in chefing, actually. So it wasn't, I didn't have a sense at all that employers were concerned that more training would lead to more people leaving. It was more that actually if they could get them to stay and do the training, their experience was that they would feel more valued and see that they had more of a career in their business. So almost the opposite. But remember, the action learning set is a really small sample. So I'm kind of really clear about that.
Yeah, and also to come in there, I think it's also about the kind of push and pull factors that are also around that. So, for example, things like access to childcare and infrastructure around that. All of these are other things that can affect how people stay or where they progress to in a workplace or where they choose to go. You know, so again, picking up in those kind of points around rural areas, you know, those were really been big factors around, you know, thinking about other things that were driving people's everyday life and how they balance those care and responsibilities as well.
Thanks, Helen and Fiona. The next point in the Q&A is about the reference made to mental health in the sector. And yes, that has been, those issues around mental health and experience of mental health problems have been increasing. And a holistic issue of wellbeing isn't part of the key challenges mentioned, as evidence proving that wellbeing is not a key issue. I will just lightly touch on that. It is an issue that has been raised in both the research we've been doing with workers and with employers. In the presentation today, we're very much focused on kind of policy critical insights, but it's definitely is something that we've heard from, and in particular a challenge for families with impacts on well-being of children, with parents who are working in long hours and having to juggle childcare, as Fiona just mentioned. So that is something that we are looking to explore, in particular what types of support is available through hospitality sector bodies around mental health as well. So Fiona, do you want to come in?
Yeah, so we know just more generally when we talk about mental health and we look at the evidence around mental health that cost of living absolutely is playing a big factor in, you know, seeing higher rates of anxiety, depression and so on. So some of that reflection in our study is not just unique to hospitality sector, but it's across the board for many people experiencing kind of low paid work. So there is a wealth of evidence in terms of what cost of living is actually doing in terms of mental health just now. So again, thinking about those wider supports that are required in terms of support from government, support from local authorities, mental health and wellbeing is a continued priority.
And yeah, on top of that, one of the issues that was raised by workers and employers is that they are time poor in relation to being able to access health services. They can't access those services when they're not in work, and they are often aren't able to plan because of kind of uncertainty around hours to make appointments to get support. So that's another issue that workers have raised with us. So Helen, were you wanting to come in with anything else? No. So Vanessa has shared, so looking at the future sustainability of the sector for employers and thus employees. So profitable businesses able to increase pay and better conditions. Did employers have any solutions? Was the value of the sector and its workers mentioned at all? I don't know whether to pass you this, Helen, in relation to any discussions they'd had around solutions that they would like to see. Would you be happy to come in on that?
I like that you're sounding a bit hesitant, because that gives me space to go, so I think they talk about some of this in the video, right? When you ask them the question about what is it that you would want from government particularly, they've got their list of things that they feel could change to improve their context. They talked a lot about, I'm not sure this directly answers the question, Vanessa, but it's in the field of what you're asking. They talked a lot about the sector being misunderstood and undervalued. And if there was an increasing evidence base of the scale of it and the impact and the importance, not just at a national level, but at a local and community level, that would be really helpful. So they felt like this sort of sense of being a sector underdog, they carried really strongly and found really frustrating. There was then some practical things they talked about around things like how difficult it can be to access training, the removal of kind of core training programs in hospitality relevant subjects that were no longer being offered at things like further education colleges, and certainly not being offered in rural further education colleges, being a real problem, and that was creating an issue both in terms of a lack of supply of new employees coming into the sector, and when they did come in, they didn't have the core skill set that they used to come in with. As one of them beautifully said in an early action learning set, no one is teaching these people how to make beds properly anymore. And so that sense of even if you did attract them, you were having to work harder as an employer to develop the core skills because there wasn't external provision around that. So absolutely a sense of a lack of awareness in key audiences of the value of the sector nationally and at a local and community level, and some specific suggestions around the sorts of things where changes might be made. Training and access routes into the industry was one of those particularly.
Thanks, Helen. I think I was a bit hesitant because we're kind of still at the stage of kind of figuring out what those solutions might look like. So thank you very much, Helen. Fiona?
Just to kind of back up the points that Helen was making, and to refer back to the data that Callum talked about earlier, particularly in remote rural areas and a percentage of employees that are dependent on the sector. So really, when we're talking about future sustainability, that needs to be front and centre, and really thinking about the smaller communities where this is absolutely a pivotal source of local employment.
That's a really good point. Thank you, Fiona. So Vanessa, hopefully that answers your question. But please do get in touch with us if you'd like to have a conversation about the research. And a comment from Drew about, had any employers fed staff on duty and offered travel cards? I certainly know from doing the interviews with workers that there were several examples, and that was identified as good practice that workers would like to see being provided with food and food that takes into account their kind of cultural needs as well during work. And Helen, was there anything that came up on that?
Only to agree with you, very common for people to be receiving meals when on duty. I don't know about travel cards. It wasn't something that was mentioned specifically, but that doesn't mean it wasn't happening. There were other benefits or provisions around this space that were also interesting. So a provision of accommodation was common, particularly in the more rural areas. And one of the barriers that more rural employees talked about was the restrictions on being able to provide accommodation to those aged between 16 and 18 if you were a venue with a license, and that was a real barrier because they wanted to provide accommodation as well as meals to employees to enable them to work in their locations, but they were prevented from doing that because of the restrictions around provision of accommodation for those aged 16 to 18. So employers trying to do good stuff, I think, around food and accommodation. I'm not aware of what they were doing around travel.
Yeah, there wasn't something that came up with workers. There was no examples of being provided with travel cards from the research with workers. And thank you, Kelly. We have come across Hospitality Health, and we'd like to be in touch with them at some point during the project. One of the things that has come out from the work we've been doing, although it's a very small sample of employers, is like the need to raise awareness of these resources that are out there already, and any gaps in help and support that is not available. But there are loads of examples such as Hospitality Health that employers can reach out to. So thank you. So we just got a few minutes left. So any burning last questions? As it Drew, you've put if January to March is downtime, could this be used to create bespoke training with a bursary to retain and upskill? I would say that, yeah, that has been something that we've spoken about, and in relation to the employers, is that a time that could be used to provide training? I think it already is. I think there was an example from an employer who did make sure that was the time of the year where they were providing opportunities for their staff, because that is a quiet time in the industry. I don't know if there's anything more to add on that, Helen.
Only briefly, the point which wasn't specific to January to March, but was particularly present in January to March, which was whereas in the past employers would describe that in the past employees were more content to come to work for training without being paid for that, particularly if it was training linked to a supplier who was promoting a new product, and there was a degree of a social element around that if you were in a bar or a restaurant. And in the past, employees would have been content to attend that without being paid. It was training, but it was also a slightly social experience. Employers described that no longer being the case, employees not having the luxury of being able to come to training and not being paid for that, which we might all think is not an unreasonable expectation, right? But that certainly there was a need to be paid to attend any training, and that in itself was a barrier for some employers who were managing finances that were so tight they simply didn't have the budget to pay staff to come in for training during quiet months when they're just not generating the income to cover those hours. So it's a little bit chicken and egg.
Thank you, Helen. So thanks everyone for joining us today. And thanks to my fellow panel members and the Serving the Future team. Please do have a look at our website and get in touch if you want to hear anything more about the Serving the Future project. Thank you.